I'm Monica Milton, Counsel for Public Defense and Special Projects here at NACDL, and you are joining us for this week's Engage in Exchange session for federal practitioners. Today we are joined by Stephen Lee, NACDL member and former federal prosecutor, along with attorney Meredith Patti and statistician Cate Rush from MCM Data Consulting. And they will be talking about judiciary sentencing information platform and how to avoid unwarranted sentencing disparities in federal cases. This program will be recorded, and we will provide you with the slides from the from this session. We ask that you put your questions in the chat for the panelists as they come up, and they will get to them as they are able to, time permitting. They also will be giving you their contact information in case anything comes up that they're not able to get to. And if there are enough questions that we don't get to today, we will post it on our Engage in Exchange on the website, and you'll have access to that along with the recording and the slides. So we are very happy to have you all here, and I'm going to pass it over to Stephen to get us started.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Monica. Thanks, Julie, for all your work getting this set up, and thanks, of course, to NACDL. So hi, everyone. My name's Stephen Lee. I'm a former federal prosecutor based in Chicago who is now a solo practitioner focusing on healthcare fraud and data analytics. But I want to talk about this because this is something, this whole idea of sentencing data and kind of avoiding the disparities is something that I thought a lot about back when I was a prosecutor. And actually, I took pretty seriously back then. And basically for me, I think just to tell a bit of the story, when I was a prosecutor, I would always say in the early days, like, oh, yes, judge, the only way to avoid unwarranted sentencing disparities was to go with the guideline sentence. But I just saw over my times, like, that can't be right. I mean, first of all, I saw all of my judges basically giving below guideline sentences in Chicago. And then I just started thinking, like, that's just, it just can't be right that that's the only way to do it. But there really wasn't a lot of data available back then. So there is more data available now. A lot of it still is going on Pacer and looking at cases and things like that. But there is more data available now. And Cate and Meredith, they do a lot of work with the raw data files that provide a lot more detail than what someone like me could access. And so we thought it'd be helpful just really to kind of talk about this and really help share kind of what's out there and what we can do with the data and also the limits. So I'm going to talk for a little bit first about what you can do kind of using, what's kind of readily available. And then Cate and Meredith will talk a lot more about what they can do with the raw data files that are harder to work with, but which they have a lot of expertise in dealing with. All right. Okay. So first of all, just for background, of course, I think everyone knows this, but we're here because of 18 USC 3553. And in particular, because of one of the factors, basically the need to avoid unwarranted sentencing disparities among defendants with similar records who have been found guilty of similar conduct. And that's tricky. And basically, and if you have any questions or want to put stuff in the chat, that's probably the easiest way to, if you want to put anything in chat, I'll try to take a look. So basically here, and like I said, back in the kind of the old days, not that long ago, kind of the only way really to do that was to really kind of, hunt around and see kind of what other people have gotten. And that's something that's kind of really can be cumbersome to do, especially because it's hard to do. I remember when I was a prosecutor, I did have a case once involving a doctor, and I actually did look around, and I did actually find two other doctors who were kind of similar to my defendant. And actually, I remember actually getting permission to recommend a below guideline sentence, in part because I found someone who was so much worse than my guy and who got a below guideline sentence. And I just didn't feel I could justifiably ask for a guideline sentence when I knew that there was this other guy who was so much worse than the guy I had convicted. And that was something that I think was helpful in terms of getting an appropriate sentence down the road. But that's hard, right? Because it's hard to find that stuff. Pacer, it's hard to find these things there. And now there are two resources that make it a lot easier than just kind of trying to find stuff out through just looking at websites and press releases and trying to find someone similar. And basically, so we're here today to talk about these two main sources that are now available. There's the Judiciary Sentencing Information, or JSIN. So that's the data that's now publicly available online and that's being rolled out around the country. And then I think probably maybe a third of you have seen or are starting to see in your districts, but a lot of the country might not have seen it because it's not fully being rolled out. The other big set of data is the raw data files that basically the U.S. Census Commission uses. That's where a lot of the JSON stuff is drawn from, but that provides a lot more detail, and that's the kind of stuff that Mary, Cate, and Meredith can work with. And they're going to talk about what they can do with the raw data files, and which is extremely useful in a lot of cases. Okay, so we're going to talk about, but that's what we're going to talk about today, these two data sets. Okay, and as I mentioned, first of all, this is starting to get rolled out. So JSON was made available a few years ago. And then last year, the Federal Judicial Center, they started this pilot program where basically they started making it a regular practice for probation officers in about a third of the districts around the country to include JSON data in the PSRs. And so this list is you can see on the screen, that's the list of the districts where it's happening. So if you're in one of these districts, you might have seen it already. But if you're not in one of these districts, you might not have. And in fact, like I just appeared, I'm in the Northern District of Illinois, which is not part of the pilot program. I just appeared in front of a judge a few weeks ago and was talking about JSON. And I'm pretty sure the judge had no clue what I was talking about until I started telling him about it and filed a little short memo explaining what JSON was and what the JSON data showed. But this is being rolled out around the country. I think people are going to see it more. And it's something to think about because, again, this is something where, especially if the judges, the probation officers, and the prosecutors you're dealing with don't know about JSON and there's favorable stuff there, then, this is obviously a great resource to use. Okay, so JSON is basically a website. That's how you access it. So the link there, this is like a screenshot of how it looks if you go there. And basically there's the URL, and I guess we can put in the chat as well, but it's json.usscgov.gov, analytics, and then basically the dashboard. And so basically if you go there, then it pulls up this kind of screen, and you can see on the left-hand side, that's where you put in the primary guideline. So that's where you put in 2B1.1, 2D 1.1, whatever is the main guideline you're dealing with, because that's the way that people are compared. And if you do 2D 1.1, it lets you pick for what is the main drug. So it's crack cocaine, et cetera. And then you can scroll down, and then obviously there's options for 924Cs, things like that, 1028As for aggravated identity theft. And then you can also do the option, do you want the sentence or imprisonment? Because that way you can see, because sometimes, just the different ways the JSON calculates things. And then, so that's what you do on the left, that's where you select some of those. And then once you do that, then what you do, you go to the sentencing table and you click on the cell that corresponds to the offense, the total offense level that you think is going to apply and the criminal history that applies. And then you click it. And then over on the right-hand side of the screen, that's when it's going to pull up the results. So if you do this, and I'll just use, we just use an example. So if let's say you did 2B 1.1, final offense level 19, criminal history category of 1, you're going to see something like this. And it basically looks back at the last 5 complete fiscal years. So I guess it'll change periodically. And it'll tell you how many defendants were sentenced with that offense level and criminal history, and basically tell you a little bit about what happened with them. And so obviously one big thing, first of all, the number, right? Obviously the more defendants, the more, I guess, it's just less variability, right? Because if you have a small sample size, that's where you get real huge shifts depending on one particular defendant. So, but you can see here that for this category, 387 defendants, and they do, for some of the data, they take out the 5K1 cooperators, because obviously those are different enough factors that it becomes, hard to compare. And then you say, then for the ones who didn't get a 5K, and who then basically, what was the average length of imprisonment and the median? And so here, and it also will give you some graphs that are very useful. So this will show you how many people got a within range sentence, only 22%. You'll see that most of the people, 51%, got a below guideline sentence. A small number got above, and about a quarter of the people got a 5K. But that tells you basically, look, even without the 5K people, about half the defendants got below guideline sentence. And actually, more than half the defendants got below guideline sentences if you include the 5K cooperators. And then it also shows how many people, we'll give you a graph showing how many people got some type of imprisonment and how many people got probation. So here you can see here at this category, 12% of the people got probation. Okay, so you can look at this, and this will and then you can export this stuff. And I think one idea is you can provide it if especially if it's helpful for you, it's very easy. You can attach it and provide it to the judge. And that's something that's, there's some caveat language that the commission would like to have included. But at least it gives some information to a judge about how these cases play out. Now, I've been looking at this data, and I kind of started playing around with it, and I started doing some analysis, because I think partially what it does kind of confirm some of the things that I long suspected in terms of the guidelines and how things worked out. So first of all, here, and just so this is something, just to see, this graph kind of shows the guideline ranges, right? And how they go up over time. And, basically that's the red, right? That's what the guideline ranges are. And for this category 1, offense level is going up to 43. 43 is life. So just imagine they're just really high for red, okay? And then if you look at 2D 1.1 and you look at powder cocaine, you can see here that the average imprisonment, the average sentence is average imprisonment is below the guidelines. Now, obviously, there's lots of variation around the country and in terms of the cases, but it does mean especially if you compare it with the other data, there are some people getting within guideline sentences, but a lot of people are getting below guidelines, enough that the average imprisonment is actually below the guidelines for pretty much just about every one of these offense levels. So now there's different ways of showing this. This is one way of showing it. Here's another way of showing it. This is kind of taking those percentages and just showing them all. I just went through and pulled it for every single offense level for category criminal history 1. And you can see here that basically a lot of, yes, a lot of, at the low levels, people are getting within guideline sentences, but at the higher up, but as you go up, a lot of people, it's not that many people getting within guideline sentences and very few people getting above guidelines. And most people are getting below guideline sentences or cooperating. That's one way of showing it. Here's another way of showing it, right? You can see here that basically pretty good percentage of people are getting below guideline sentences for powder cocaine cases. And here, another way of looking at it, probation, right? You can see here that this tells you how many people are getting probation. Obviously, the higher up you go, very less likely, but there at least gives you some sense of things. And this data, of course, look, it obviously can be useful for your particular case. It can also be useful for helping set expectations, realistic expectations with your clients. People can obviously come in with their ideas, but it could be helpful at times to point out, like, well, you may think that, and yes, there's a chance the judge could go there, but let me just show you how it's worked out around the country. All right. So that's for powder cocaine. And what's interesting, I think, especially in terms of white collar cases, when we talk about 2B 1.1, there the data shows that the average imprisonment, average sentences are lower. So again, it's below, the average sentences are below the guidelines, but they're even lower than they were for the powder cocaine. And so that is something that I think is very useful to keep in mind as you go about doing things. Again, if a prosecutor is saying that the only way to avoid unwarranted disparities is to go with below guidelines, I just think that's factually wrong. I just think that's something that you can really push back against using the data, because that's just not true nationally. Most people are getting below guideline sentences, and the average sentences are below the guidelines. So any prosecutor says that, I think it's really they're not working with the real data about how it's really going on around the country. Now, Mary Kate and Meredith are going to talk about 2B 1.1 a lot more, I think, especially because I think one thing that, especially for anyone who does white collar cases, 2B 1.1, it's so many factors involved, right? And there's so many offenses that go to it. It is still, you're not really comparing maybe apples to apples. You're maybe comparing apples to fruit, right? You're still, it's better than nothing, but you're still comparing your case against so many other cases that are different. But anyway, this is one way of showing the data. Let me show it. A different way of showing it is, again, here, and this is even more so than kind of what you saw with the powder cocaine cases. But here, even fewer people are getting within guideline sentences or above guideline sentences. Again, most people, the vast majority of people are getting below guideline sentences, whether or not they cooperate. All right. So let's see. Okay. Let's see. And let me just go through a few more. And then here again, this again showing it for 2B 1.1, lots of people getting below guideline sentences. And here you can see that actually probation, you can see here that actually it's more than with the 2B than with the powder cocaine cases. Not a lot of people, obviously, as you go higher up, but still look at level 33 and level 34. Someone got, at least one person, one or two people got probation at that level. And Meredith and Mary Kate can talk about more about this and kind of some of the nuances here. All right, I'm going to pass it on to them in a moment, and then we'll come back for questions. I think one of the big things here is that, obviously, I think when I look at this data, I think it can be helpful. I think it is a bit of a blunt instrument because there's lots of nuances that you can't see on the website. But I do think, again, it can be helpful, at least in kind of rebutting some of the prosecutorial arguments, and also showing the judges, like, there is more nuance here that I think it's appreciated. And I think it might be helpful, especially in educating the newer judges who might otherwise, not have this appreciation that maybe more experienced judges might have with how sentencing works. So let's see. I'm going to pass it on to them, and then I'll be back at the end to talk about some questions. All right.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Mary Kate, and this is Meredith Patti sitting next to me. We are the partners of MCM Data Consulting. We have, for the past 20 years, been working in the raw data files of the sentencing commissions to assist federal defense attorneys in determining whether their client's recommended sentence is actually in line with how similar defendants are being sentenced nationally. By the way, we're going to hold the questions, as Stephen had mentioned, until the end of our presentation. Next, please, Stephen. Now, MCM, like Jason, utilizes the United States Sentencing Commission's raw data files. These data files include all federal defendants sentenced nationally. We utilize the files going back to fiscal year 1999 through 2022, I'm sorry. And there are over 1.7 million defendants who have been sentenced over that time period. The data files contain over 20,000 variables that can be utilized in determining similar sentences. Despite the wealth of this information contained in the data files, Jason is limited to the information it provides. In fact, Jason is driven by 3 data points and provides the user with only basic sentencing information. Next, please, Stephen. So a defendant's total offense level does not tell the full story. In most white-collar cases, a defendant's guideline calculation is driven by loss. And in a drug case, it is driven by the quantity of the drug. The USSC data files contain the complete guideline calculation for each defendant and identifies the precise loss amount in a fraud case, and in a drug case, the drug type and the quantity of the drugs. This is the level of detail that should be considered when identifying similar defendants. There are other important factors that should be considered as well, including, for instance, whether the defendant pled guilty or went to trial. The statute or statutes of conviction and statutory range are very important. Take a defendant scored according to the fraud guideline, for instance. There are over 300 statutes that direct the score to 2B1.1. The data files not only provide the statute of conviction or statutes of conviction, but also categorize these fraud offenses based on the specific offense conduct. The categories include, for example, healthcare fraud versus securities fraud or mortgage fraud. There are in total 21 different categories. This is extremely helpful when using the data files to find defendants who are most similar to your client. Another factor to consider is that JSON fails to include a host of important sentencing information. First and foremost, the default JSON setting doesn't include probationers in their calculation of averages. So unless the user knows to click the box on that left-hand side of the screen that Stephen showed earlier, the outcomes that JSON generates are only for those who were sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Additionally, in cases where there are alternative sentences imposed, whether they are community confinement, intermittent confinement, or home detention, those months of alternatives are included in the calculation of average sentence length. Therefore, a defendant sentenced to 24 months of imprisonment is treated in JSON the very same way that a defendant who was sentenced to 1 day of time served and 24 months of home detention is considered. And that skews the averages and doesn't provide the user with complete information. In contrast, the USSC data files provide this type of information and is essential if you want to describe the actual sentences imposed on similar defendants. Next, please. This slide includes more information about factors that aren't considered by JSON. JSON only provides national findings and does not address circuit and district findings. Also, if your client did receive a 5K, JSON doesn't provide any outcomes for those defendants who received a 5K downward departure. JSON does not provide any information also about why an outside the range sentence was given. However, again, this information is provided in the data files. Every reason listed in the statement of reasons for the imposition of an outside the range sentence is included in the files. This type of information is very important. For example, if you have a fraud defendant who has poor physical condition, you would be able to locate similar defendants in the USSC data files who received an outside the range sentence and had physical condition listed as a reason for the outside the range sentence. And JSON doesn't have that capability. Next, please, Stephen.
We thought it would be good to walk you through an example to illustrate the different capabilities of JSON versus the USSC data files and how important this is when trying to locate most similar defendants and analyze sentencing outcomes. So here we have our example, defendant John Smith. He pleaded guilty to violating 18 U.S.C. 371 and will be sentenced in the Middle District of Florida. He's a criminal history category 1, has no criminal history points, and is not going to receive a substantial assistance downward departure. According to his PSR, he scored according to 2B1.1, and he's going to receive a 20 level increase for loss. And his total offense level is 27, but given his statutory maximum sentence of 60 months, his guideline range is 60 months of imprisonment. Next slide, please. So if you were using JSON, you would select the following information: scored according to 2B1.1, total offense level 27, and criminal history category 1. Note, like has been previously mentioned, JSON only includes information on those defendants who did not receive a substantial assistance downward departure, and the user does not have the ability to include defendants who received this departure. Next slide. So after selecting that criteria, JSON would inform you that there were 168 defendants that met this criteria, and of those 168 defendants, 166 of them, or 99%, received some sentence of imprisonment. Additionally, Jason would also tell you that for these 168 defendants, the average sentence imposed was 49 months and the median sentence imposed was 48 months. So like Stephen said, a sentence below the guideline range. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. So in comparison, if you were using the USSC data files, in addition to the criteria you would select using Jason, that is scored according to 2B 1.1, criminal history category 1, and total offense level, you could select additional criteria to be more similar to Mr. Smith. You could select 0 criminal history points, entered into a plea agreement, violated 18 USC 371 and only that statute, received a 20-level increase to their guideline calculation for loss, and of course, did not receive a 5K 1.1 downward departure. Next slide, please. So after selecting all of this criteria, you would be left with 20 defendants who met this criteria who were sentenced nationally. That is, there were 20 guilty pleading, 0-point criminal history category 1 defendants scored according to 2B 1.1 who violated 18 USC 371 and only that statute, received a 20-level increase for loss, were total offense level 27, and did not receive a substantial assistance downward departure. And what you'd find would be of these 20 defendants, 1 defendant, or 5%, received a probationary sentence. 5 defendants, or 25%, were sentenced to 1 day of imprisonment, time served, and 14 defendants, or 70%, were sentenced to a term of imprisonment greater than 1 day. You would also find that the average on these 20 defendants was 23.1 months of imprisonment, and the median sentence imposed was 1 year and a day. You would also see that none of these 20 defendants were sentenced in the Middle District of Florida. So these findings, they differ dramatically from the Jason findings. And the reason for this difference is that by using the USSC data files, you're able to identify similar defendants using more selection criteria than Jason allows. Next slide, please. So as previously discussed, and as seen on this chart in blue, Jason provides an average sentence length for Mr. Smith's case of 49 months and a median of 48 months. In comparison, using the USSC data files and selecting only those cases most similar to Mr. Smith, this results in a lower average sentence and median sentence. Specifically, the average sentence length is almost 26 months lower than Jason's findings, and the median is 36 months lower than Jason's findings. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this slide highlights the importance of knowing the full details of the sentence imposed. As we previously mentioned, Jason does not provide information about the precise type of sentence. It only identifies whether a defendant was sentenced to probation or sentenced to imprisonment, either in whole or in part. Jason does not give any precise information about alternative sentences or whether the sentence imposed was time served. So let's say your client is Mr. Smith, the client in our example, and let's say your goal is to keep him out of prison. Recall that in a previous slide, Jason reported a probationary sentence in 1% of the cases for Mr. Smith. For those defendants sentenced to imprisonment, Jason does not indicate whether any of these defendants were sentenced to time served of 1 day, the day of credit for processing. Therefore, if you were to use Jason in your sentencing memorandum for Mr. Smith, you would have to say that defendants like Mr. Smith were sentenced to a non-prison sentence in only 1% of the cases. Now, recall the findings for Mr. Smith when using the USSC data files. These findings revealed that 5% received a probationary sentence and 25% were sentenced to time served of 1 day. So using the USSC data files would allow you to tell the sentencing judge that in 30% of the cases, the defendants most similar to Mr. Smith were sentenced to either probation or time served of 1 day. This is dramatically different from the Jason findings. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned by Stephen, Jason is appearing in PSRs around the country. Attorneys need to be prepared to respond to these Jason findings. One concern of ours is the anchoring effect these Jason findings may have on the sentencing judge. Therefore, it is important for you to let the judge know about the deficiencies of Jason and to provide a more complete analysis of the sentences imposed on defendants most similar to your client. To end where we began, knowing how similar defendants have been sentenced is vital information. Jason attempts to do this, but in our opinion, is not precise enough to make meaningful comparisons. Jason may be better than providing no information at all, but by not utilizing the USSC's data files, which are available on the Sentencing Commission's website, you may be doing a great disservice to your clients. So we are happy to answer any questions you have or.
I think Stephen wanted to speak again.
Yes, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah. So, so I just want to kind of like talk a little bit about some of the practicalities of this and also kind of see how people, and I'd love to hear how people have seen this. So if you want to put in the chat how you've seen it used or not used, that'd be very interesting. But, one of the things I think it's useful for, so first of all, one of the big things is, as Mary Kate and Meredith talked about, there's huge limits, right, in the Jason data. So that's why, depending on what you want to do, first of all, you need to know those limits so that, one, if the government's using the Jason data to argue for a longer sentence, you know how to attack them, all right? So you bring out all the things, all the limits, and all the problems with the data. And also, if you are using it, you know how the government's going to come back, right? And I think one person in the chat talked about this a little bit. There are limits. One thing that I did, I've been talking to Meredith and Mary Kate for some of my cases, and it's been kind of interesting seeing how the data has been useful and kind of limits there. So for example, I had one case where, to be honest, the data was not good. Okay, the data was not promising, but it was at least useful to help set some more, hopefully, realistic expectations with my client as to how this was going to play out. He had very unrealistic ideas of how his sentencing was going to go, and it helped me to be able to show him, like, look, that may be the case. You may hope for that, but look, let me just show you the numbers and how this is going around the country. Another way it was helpful was basically because I think one issue is that when you look at the Jason data, it is hard to know because there are lots of details that aren't there, okay, and that aren't being shown. And then, I'll put up the content for later, but I'll come back to that. Let me just take off the stop share for a little bit. But one thing that was helpful in one of my cases was actually, I had a case which involved a little bit more specific statute, and I was looking for more comparables. So Mary Kate and Meredith were actually able to run their data and give me a report about here, because I was like, who are these 8 cases, right? It was a small enough number. And what they were do, first of all, one limitation of the data they have is it's still anonymized, right? So they don't know exactly they don't know exactly who the defendant was. They don't know exactly who the judge was. But to be honest, this was a specific enough set of universe and a specific enough case. To be honest, I was able to figure out, okay, who some of the people were, just because there weren't that many of those cases. And so that was helpful for me because then I could go even more precise and see how things played out. And I could even pull stuff off Pacer to see how the case, see what was argued, a little more detail, and see how things worked out. And that might be useful depending on your case. Because also, especially there, I've had situations where, I've used Pacer, I've used Jason, I used Pacer. I've actually even just called up defense attorneys, say, look, I'm really trying to figure out exactly what happened in your case and why this came out a certain way. Can you just tell me what happened? And so that way, I can portray things as in the most detailed way possible to the judge, and I can kind of rebut some of these arguments that the government makes. So I had one case, for example, where as the government was arguing for forfeiture. And I was even able to go back to one of the defense lawyers who explained that, yeah, actually the judgment in Jane C is actually technically wrong because it wasn't really restitution, it was really forfeiture, but it was effectively, it was just, so that was something that I was able to use in one of my arguments. So I think it's all kind of like all these different pieces that are out there. And I think it's something that, again, we all need to know about this because, again, the government's going to use it when the numbers are good for them, right? And, we need to be able to kind of, there are ways to counter it, and vice versa. So let's see. So I think I saw some questions that came up. And let's see, I think some things, one is, I think, first of all, every federal offense, obviously you should be able to find JSON data by looking at the guideline, by going to the primary guideline. It's going to be, at least narrow it down somewhat. So I think that's one thing that you can help, and you should definitely encourage you to kind of play around with the data in the dashboard there. But yeah, Kate, Meredith, any questions that come up that you want to address or any points you want to share?
Well, I see the question with regard to possession versus distribution of child porn. And on JSON, there is no way to distinguish that. You simply would pick the 2G 2.2,
Right.
and they would lump everybody together in that case. It's
Let's see. So
where
yeah,
JSON
Mary Kate,
lacks
right.
that capability.
Right.
We can determine that. We can go into the larger data files and we can determine it by the statute of conviction.
The base offense level, different specific offense characteristics. We see that, and you all can see that too if you download these raw data files. You see the guideline scoring for every single defendant included in these data files. So you can see, you see everything from the guideline calculation to the total offense level to the sentence imposed. And like we discussed, the reasons for the outside the range sentence as well.
Let's see. There's a question in terms of the raw data files. I think they're just so I'll maybe talk about that a little bit and then maybe pass it on to you, to Meredith and Mary Kate to expand. Again, the Sentencing Commission does have a lot of stuff available online, but it's not very user friendly. I think like there are like the raw data files, and they're also huge and massive. So if you could download the raw data file for a particular year. The problem is it's going to be massive. And the problem is you cannot open it up with Microsoft Excel or one of the standard programs. You're going to need to use at least a program like Microsoft Access or some program that's more specific for very large data sets.
It needs to be opened in SPSS or SAS. That's how it needs to be opened. And then once it's opened in SPS, we use SPSS. And once it's open in SPSS, we can then pull from SPSS and download into Excel. Because of course it becomes a much more manageable pool of defendants. So yes, you would need the software in order to open a year's worth of data files. And you have to be careful when you do open that 1 year, you have to be aware of changes if within the guidelines from year to year. Specific offense characteristics are added and deleted. So you can't simply just open multiple years of data, put it all together, and assume that you're looking at the same specific offense characteristic from year to year. You have to be aware of the changes that are made to the guidelines each year.
Okay, so Meredith and Mary Kate, there's a question in the chat about kind of like, yeah, what does a typical engagement look like? So if someone here were to want to get your help to analyze the raw data files, like how long does that take? What's the typical cost? What's the kind of ultimate? And I know the answer to some of these things, but is there ultimately something you can provide to a judge? What does that look like?
Okay. So our engagement letter would detail exactly the steps we would take in your client's case. And it mentions that we're aware of the confidentiality of the information that we would receive from the defense attorney that would allow us to do our work properly, understand the case, etc. Go ahead.
What we do in our engagement is we lay out the parameters of what we're going to do for you and your client. So, you know, the basics, you know, the guideline we're going to analyze, some of the particulars, you know, whether your client entered into a plea agreement or was convicted after trial, whether your client's getting a 5K or no 5K, the basics, the things like that. And then what we do is we start the analysis. I should say up front that we're with you from the time we're engaged until the sentencing memo is filed. You know, we work very closely with the defense attorney, with our drafts and what we see in the data. You know, it's definitely a back and forth, a working relationship between us. And as we proceed within the data, you know, we might see things of, oh, we may want to look at it from this point of view or that point of view. So we do that as well. And we charge by flat fee. Obviously, it depends on the complexity of what we're asked to do. Our rates typically range from $5,000 to $7,500 per case. We also do CJA work. We've done CJA work in many districts. We feel it's important. And so we've done a lot of CJA work as well.
Okay. And then actually, if you look in terms of the end of work product, I think, you know, I think actually, if you go to Mary Kate and Meredith's website, they have a sample analysis of the kind of thing that they generate. And those basically can be, or in a format that can be provided to a judge, right, as an exhibit.
Yes, yes. What attorneys do who work with us in their section, in their sentencing memo on avoiding unwarranted sentencing disparity, they pull from our report the key findings they really want to highlight. And that's what they discuss in that section of the memorandum. And then they just drop in a footnote saying the analysis in its entirety can be seen at Appendix X. And that's how attorneys normally use our reports. There are times we're brought in pre-plea, for example, so we can analyze data based on different statutes of conviction. Say if they're trying to decide whether to plead to statute A or statute B, we can run an analysis on both of those statutes. So the defense attorney and the client can get a sense on how people are being sentenced on that particular statute. So we do that too, but typically, more often we're brought in at the sentencing stage. And the whole report is attached as an appendix. And the sentencing judge, if the sentencing judge wishes, you know, this isn't, as we've made clear, this isn't a data file that we've created. This is the raw sentencing data from the Sentencing Commission. So for everything that the Sentencing Commission does, whether it's a source book, publication, report, it all comes from this set of data files. So the sentencing judge, if the sentencing judge wanted to, the judge could call up the Sentencing Commission and give the commission the steps that we took in preparing the analysis, and the Sentencing Commission would come back with the same pool of defendants that we did. I mean, there's nothing that we manipulate. There's nothing that we have not created our own internal database. It's all there. So it makes it a very unbiased report that provides the information people are looking for, how similar defendants are being sentenced around the country, in the circuit, and in the sentencing district.
And I'll just say, there was, like, for example, when I worked with them on one of my cases, there was a back and forth because we were trying to part of it was trying to figure out which arguments we were going to emphasize, things like which factors to go with, things like that. And so we went back and forth a bit so we could see different permutations and to see what made the most sense to do.
I'll just answer that question. The fee ranges. The fee ranges from typically from $5,000 to $7,500 flat fee. But obviously, you know, our goal is also to help people. So if you have a unique circumstance, please talk to us and we're happy to work with you.
Let me address the one other question that came up in chat, and actually, because that is something that I've heard people talk about, that because the sense, I'll just share my screen again. So here, like again, we've been talking mostly about the JSON dashboard, okay? And so this is something that, you know, is now, you know, been available, I don't know, maybe a year or two. But I think there are other dashboards that Sentencing Commission has. And this is one, the Interactive Data Analyzer. And so this comes up, and I think here, I think the big difference, you know, and this is, there are big differences. This one doesn't let you go more by circuit. It lets you go more for demographics. And it does have factors here for guideline and crime and things like that. The big issue here is it doesn't factor in offense level, right? And so that creates creates a huge, that's a huge factor. And especially because I think if you look around the country, you know, I think there are numbers wise, there's a lot more people charged at the lower levels, you know, maybe because again, like, you know, look, given like the prosecution, like I'm from Chicago, I was in AUSA there. Given the prosecution guidelines in Chicago, we tended to only prosecute people who would be at the higher offense levels, right? But nationally, the guidelines are different. The prosecution guidelines are different. So whenever I tried to look into it, there were a lot of people around the country who were being charged at much lower offense levels, and those skew the numbers lower. So again, this might give you some nice data that might be helpful, but that's the comeback to it that the government is going to use, because your numbers these numbers don't take into account offense level. So
I'm sorry, go on, Stephen.
Yeah, so this could be useful, but again, there's limitations with this data, and there are easy ways for the government to attack it. So I would definitely take a look at this, but I would look at this, look at JSON, and then you could go on and do more, right? And then obviously, but the raw data really have the stuff that, you know, that really help you make more apples to apples comparisons.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would suggest too, going on to the Sentencing Commission's website, and when you go to the page that contains these data files, it also contains the code book. So you can scan the code book just to get an idea of what's included in these data files. I mean, the code book is large, and it's pretty incredible how much they're able to code into these data files. And I think looking at the code book would give you a good idea of the type of information you could get from these data files.
Yeah, I'll share that too, actually, so people can see.
Excellent.
So yeah, I mean, look, I gotta admit, you know, I'm pretty good with data for a lawyer, but I gotta admit, really knowing how to do this stuff, this is pretty hard. This is pretty complicated if you don't know how to code or are familiar with things like SAS or things like that.
No,
so
passed it. You just passed it. Go up. Above supplemental, right there. Code book.
Yeah.
Yep.
There you go.
So right. So
As you, yep. Tells you what's been added from year to year. Gives you a description of how you interpret the different, I know it looks overwhelming, but if you read the description, it gives you a good idea of the different types of variables included. And at the end of that, it breaks it down, you know, guideline specific variables, defendant characteristic variables, all sorts. The end is good too, as a good overview for the different types of variables.
yeah.
Yes. So when you see.
Right, there are monetary variables,
Yes.
or chapter 4.
Yes. I mean, we've done all, you know, people come to us for all different types of analyses, you know, and we've had cases where the amount of fine. A defense attorney was interested in us researching fines imposed on a particular defendant. We've done analyses based on sentencing trends in elderly defendants. You know, all sorts of different analyses depending on the client's needs.
All right, let's see. So I think one thing that we've talked about is, and why we thought this would be useful to do is because, like, I think we're just getting started, right, with this. I think this is something where I think a lot of judges, a lot of prosecutors, probation officers, I think a lot of defense attorneys don't even know even any of this is available, right? And I think as we go, I think it's going to become more and more common. And I think it's going to be something that I think people should be aware of. And especially if you're in a district where this is already being rolled out, well, it's good to know how to counter it, right? Especially if to point out the limitations or to use it to your advantage when you can. And if you're in a district where it's not being rolled out, well, then, you could be the first one to educate a judge about, and you might be able to make some points. And so, to be honest, I think the judge that I appeared in front of not too long ago, I think it was kind of at least, I guess, useful, right, to be able to talk about it and go through it. And also, I think we're going to see but I think we're going to evolve, right? I think hopefully as we all go, love to see how people use this and not use it, and obviously share things over the next few years as I think Jason is used more, and maybe even as the raw data files are used more. So hopefully this will be an interesting thing to see, check in on, another year or two from now down the road and see where we're at. I've heard from some lawyers who've used it, here and there in their cases, and we'll just see more and more of it. Let's see. And then, but yeah, let me think. I'm not sure in terms of the pilot program. I think, like I said, a third of the districts are using it. I think they're testing it to see kind of like, I think that they're probably going to roll out nationally, but I think they're just doing a pilot program to see how judges, I think, probably react to it.
How it's used and how it's being followed. I think that's the purpose of the pilot program. And anyone can use JSON. Defense attorneys, as we've talked about, can use it in their sentencing memos. You see it in certain PSRs. The government can use it in their sentencing submissions as well. But I think the purpose of the pilot program is to see how judges are sentencing given the JSON information.
Right, and it's not the USSC that initiated JSON being placed in PSRs in these pilot districts. It's the federal judiciary that made that decision to have this pilot program, have those JSON results in the PSRs in those districts.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing that I think Mary Kate, we were talking about earlier, that is kind of interesting to think about also is this is meant to be a resource for the judges, right? I think that was actually a big part of how this all got started, because there were judges asking for this information. Mm-hmm. So that is something to maybe even consider, right? Now, because obviously if one of us calls up the U.S. Sentencing Commission and asks for more stuff, that's not going to go very far. But, if you have the right case and you have the right judge, that might be worth considering, like asking the judge to ask the Sentencing Commission to provide more information. That's something that might be worth, I don't know if anyone's done that yet, but that's, again, once the door's opened, it's more and more
for what they're asking for. You just want to make sure you're providing the judge with the right types of information so they ask for the right thing, so it really is similar to the particular client.
Like we said, we've been doing this for 20 years, right? And I think that the most common comment that we hear from defense attorneys after they've been before the judge is that the judge is astonished that they were able to provide this type of detailed information, mm-hmm. and how much the judges wish they had that in every case.
Yes, they appreciate
over and over again. That's what we hear.
Yep.
So
All right, so I'm putting our contact information back on the screen. If you want to reach us, you can talk about it. There are emails there. But yeah, look, again, we want to do this because we thought that a lot of people might not know about this, and we just want to get the word out to everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen and Mary Kate and Meredith for this presentation. I'm sure that our audience finds it very useful. I want to remind folks that this is open to non-members. This is one of the few times that we open it up to non-members, but we do want you all to consider becoming members to get more programming like this. It will be behind a paywall, and we do a ton of programming year-round. We have some upcoming Engage and Exchange sessions coming up in April and May, so register for those, but do consider joining. And as you see in the chat, plenty of people love being members of NACDL. Stephen, I'm sure you can attest to that as a member yourself, to get this kind of these kinds of resources that you otherwise would not have access to. So we did open it up to allow non-members to see what we do. And so please consider joining, please consider donating. I think Julie put in the chat, part of our funding for our staff and the things that NACDL does is through our foundation as well. So consider joining or donating, and also look forward to the recording of this session. The slides, they're going to provide them. They've been gracious enough to add their contact information if any other questions come up. But really, thank you, Stephen, Mary Kay, and Meredith for this presentation. I think it was excellent, and I'm hopeful that people are able to use it to advocate for their clients. So with that said, we'll close it down for the day. Please register for our next Engage and Exchange sessions, and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.